In the glittering world of Chicago's elite, power often costs more than love can afford. Ethan Whitmore had everything: wealth, brilliance, and a heart locked behind glass. For years, he built an empire that feared him, but never knew him. Then, one winter evening, in a moment of pride and impulse, he asked his loyal secretary, Grace Ellison, to be his date to a prestigious gala. What he didn't know was that a single night and one breathtaking emerald gown would unravel the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. This is not just a story about romance. It's a story about what happens when success meets humanity, when a woman's quiet strength awakens something long forgotten in a man who thought he could no longer feel. Stay with us as we follow a journey of power, redemption, and second chances where love doesn't arrive in grand gestures, but in the smallest, most human moments. Because sometimes, the greatest transformations don't happen in boardrooms or mansions. They begin with one look and one heart learning to beat again. Chicago, in winter, is a city that doesn't forgive softness. The wind off Lake Michigan cuts through wool and pride alike, and the sky often hangs low, a dull pewter lid pressing over the skyline. Inside the glass tower of Whitmore Innovations, where everything gleamed and nothing felt warm, Ethan Whitmore moved through his empire like a man made of frost and precision. Every inch of his office spoke of control: the polished mahogany desk, the silent phone, the view that swallowed the city whole, to the world. Ethan was the kind of man success sculpted brilliant, admired, utterly untouchable. His suits were tailored to perfection, his words economical, his emotions a rumor. The press called him the mind behind tomorrow, but inside, there was only the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint echo of loneliness he never named. Grace Ellison, his executive assistant, had worked for him for 8 years, 8 winters and summers of keeping his world in order. She was the quiet heartbeat behind his empire, efficient, graceful, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and deadlines with equal care. To colleagues, she was dependable, unshakably kind, and always composed. What they didn't know was that, beyond her calm smile, there was a story of divorce finalized 5 years ago, a teenage son she raised alone, and an aging father in a small apartment on the west side of the city. Grace never complained. She wore her responsibilities like an invisible cloak, heavy, yes, but dignified. Every morning, she walked into the office through the revolving doors, snow sometimes clinging to her coat, coffee warming her hands, her heart steady. She never expected gratitude from Ethan, only fairness. And in his own distant way, he gave her that. Until one cold Thursday in January, that morning, Ethan received an email that made his jaw tighten: an invitation to the annual Tech Innovators Gala, the most prestigious event of the year. The guest list was a who's who of industry power players, journalists, investors, and, as he soon learned, Clara Vance, his former partner both in business and in love. Clara had always known how to draw attention, how to make him feel small and sharp all at once. She'd left Whitmore Innovations 2 years earlier, taking half the design team and a piece of his pride with her. Seeing her name on that invitation brought back the old sting, the one he'd buried under a mountain of spreadsheets and silence. That afternoon, as the snow tapped against the office windows, Ethan called Grace in. She entered, notebook in hand, unaware that this conversation would tilt the quiet balance of their years together. He didn't look up at first. The Innovators Gala, Saturday night, Palmer House Hotel. Yes, sir, Grace replied, pen ready. Would you like me to confirm your attendance? He hesitated, something he never did. Yes, and I'll need a +1. Grace blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. A +1. Yes. His voice carried that clipped decisiveness she'd learned to navigate. It's expected. I'd prefer not to attend alone. He paused. I'd like you to come with me. There was a moment, one heartbeat too long, where the air seemed to thin between them. Grace's pen stilled. Me? Sir Ethan nodded, eyes fixed on the city beyond the window. You're professional. You know how these events work. It's simply easier. She knew what the gossip mill could do. The company's corridors were already alive with whispers about lesser things. A CEO and his assistant appearing at a black tie gala together. It would feed the rumor machine for weeks. But she also knew how much he valued reputation and how deeply pride could wound him. She drew a slow breath. If that's what you need, Mr. Whitmore, I'll be there. He finally looked at her, not as an employee, not as the woman who scheduled his meetings and saved his company from chaos more times than he noticed, but as someone he hadn't really seen before. Her expression was calm, her tone respectful, yet there was something behind her eyes, a quiet strength, a self-possession that unsettled him in ways he didn't understand. "Thank you." "Grace," he said quietly. She nodded, closing her notebook. "I'll make the arrangements." And with that, she turned and walked toward the door. The soft click of her heels echoed across the office, the sound fading into the hum of the city below. Ethan watched her watch the way she moved with purpose and grace, the way she seemed immune to the cold he carried like armor. When the door closed, silence filled the space again. He should have felt satisfied. It was a logical solution to a social inconvenience. But instead, an unfamiliar unease crept into him. Something about her acceptance, the calm certainty of it, lingered like a faint perfume. He walked to the window, staring down at the gray city. Snowflakes drifted past the glass, catching the light before melting away. For the first time in a long while. Ethan Whitmore couldn't quite focus on his next meeting, his next deal, or his next strategy. He found himself thinking of Grace, her patience, her quiet competence, the small, human warmth she brought into his sterile world. He'd spent years believing emotions were distractions, that vulnerability was a liability. But as the evening light dimmed over Chicago, something inside him shifted, not enough to understand, but enough to feel. He didn't know why the thought of her walking into the ballroom beside him made his pulse quicken. He only knew that it did. And as he watched the snow fall harder against the glass, Ethan realized, for reasons he couldn't name, that the simple act of inviting Grace Ellison to a gala had unsettled the perfect order of his world. He turned off the office lights, the city's glow washing over him in silver and blue. Somewhere below, Grace was already on her way home, her breath clouding in the winter air, unaware that she had just become the first crack in the ice that guarded his heart. That night, long after the city had folded into silence, Ethan lay awake. His penthouse windows framed the skyline like a painting, bright, cold, distant. He told himself it was just another event, another night to endure with practiced charm. But beneath the steady hum of the city, a quiet restlessness had begun to stir. The image of Grace walking out of his office kept replaying the calm tilt of her chin, the faint smile that said she understood more than he did. By Saturday evening, Chicago was cloaked in winter's silver breath. The streets shimmered with melted snow, and the Grand Palmer House Hotel glowed like a golden jewel in the heart of downtown. Valets in black coats rushed between limousines, and the marble lobby buzzed with laughter, champagne, and the low hum of wealth and ambition. Ethan arrived first. True to his reputation, he looked impeccable, tailored black tuxedo, every detail immaculate. Yet, beneath the polished surface, he felt an unfamiliar tension, something between anticipation and unease. He stood by the mirrored wall of the ballroom, exchanging polite greetings, the kind that meant nothing and filled the silence. Then she appeared. Grace Ellison stepped through the arched doorway, and for a brief, breathless moment, time seemed to hesitate. She wore an emerald green gown, simple yet breathtaking, the kind of elegance that didn't shout, but whispered. The silk fabric caught the light like water, flowing with every movement. Her hair, usually pinned in practical neatness, now framed her face in soft waves. There were no diamonds, no extravagance, just a quiet confidence that drew every eye in the room toward her. Ethan turned, half expecting to greet the same Grace who handed him reports and scheduled board meetings. But the woman before him wasn't his assistant. She was something else entirely poised, luminous, entirely her own. For a second, he forgot his own name. Grace met his gaze with a small, steady smile. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." He tried to speak, but words came slower than usual. "Grace, you look—" He stopped, searching for something that didn't sound mechanical, incredible. Her cheeks warmed slightly, but she kept her composure. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." That small flicker of humor, subtle, human, warm, broke through his usual control. He found himself smiling, a real one this time, not the one he reserved for investors and headlines. As they entered the ballroom together, conversation rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Some faces whispered recognition, the elusive CEO with his assistant on his arm. A few curious glances lingered. Others smiled knowingly. But Grace held herself with quiet dignity, her presence soft yet commanding, the kind that made gossip feel small. The evening moved through the usual rituals, champagne toasts, applause for new ventures, speeches that blended praise with self-congratulation. But for Ethan, the night had shifted, every sound the violin in the corner. The clinking of crystal seemed dimmed against the sound of Grace's laughter. They stood side by side at their table, and what began as polite small talk soon became something more. She told him about her son, Noah, who just turned 16, and how he'd inherited her father's stubbornness. She spoke about caregiving, about the quiet exhaustion that came with loving people who forget your name but never your face. Ethan listened, truly listened for the first time in years. In return, he found himself telling her things he never shared with anyone. About his mother, who taught him discipline but not tenderness. About how success, once it came, felt more like armor than freedom. Between them, the air softened. Somewhere across the room, a photographer, one of those ever-present vultures of prestige, lifted his camera. A single flash captured a fleeting moment, Ethan looking at Grace. Not as his assistant, not as a strategic partner, but as the only real thing in a room full of artifice. The photo would circulate later headlines, speculation, whispered intrigue, but in that moment, neither of them knew or cared. They danced once, just to be polite. It wasn't rehearsed or perfect. She laughed when he misstepped. He laughed because she did. For the first time, Ethan Whitmore felt something unfamiliar in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine or the music. He caught himself studying the way the emerald gown shimmered under the chandelier, the way her eyes held both kindness and courage. Grace, for her part, noticed the small cracks in his polished exterior, the gentler man hidden beneath all that ice. As the night drew on, the air outside thickened with snow again, and, inside, the ballroom pulsed with light and motion. But to Ethan, everything else blurred. The gala, the speeches, the polite applause, all of it faded into the background. When the final toast was made and the crowd began to thin, Grace excused herself to collect her coat. Ethan watched her walk away through the sea of glittering gowns and tuxedos, her figure framed by the glow of the chandeliers. The same unease from that Thursday returned. Only now, it wasn't confusion. It was awareness. For 8 years, he had known Grace Ellison, or thought he had, but tonight, watching her disappear through the hotel doors into the soft swirl of snow, he realized how little he truly knew. He remained there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, feeling the cool press of reality return. Around him, the noise of the gala, continued laughter, clinking glasses, the hollow sound of triumph. Yet all he could think about was the woman in the emerald gown and the strange, undeniable truth that had settled into his chest. For the first time, Ethan Whitmore felt, and as the flashbulb from that earlier photograph burned quietly in the memory of a camera, the first whisper of scandal and perhaps destiny had already begun to form. The Monday after the gala arrived like a storm that didn't announce itself quiet at first, then spreading through the building like wind through a wheat field. The night at the Palmer House already felt like a dream half remembered. For Ethan, It had lingered all weekend, flashes of emerald silk, the warmth of Grace's laughter, the strange ease between them that no meeting or memo could explain. But Monday morning, reality waited sharp, cold, and merciless. As it always did, Whitmore Innovations was never silent for long. The hum of conversation usually meant business stock reports, client meetings, market forecasts. But that morning, the tone had shifted. The air carried something lighter, sharper, and far more dangerous whispers. "They look quite close, didn't they?" Someone murmured near the coffee station. "Did you see the photo? The one from the Tribune?" Another voice replied. "He's looking at her like, well, not like a boss." The whispers spread with the speed of caffeine. By mid-morning, the entire 22nd floor knew their CEO had attended the gala with his assistant. And the world, or at least the office world, was very interested in what that meant. Grace Ellison arrived at 8:05 sharp. As always, her hair neatly pinned, her steps measured, her face calm. She had seen the photo too. It was impossible to miss. It had been circulating online since Sunday evening. Ethan Whitmore, stoic and immaculate, caught mid-glance toward her, a look that the camera had turned into a story all its own. She'd stared at it once, over her kitchen counter, her morning coffee cooling beside her. The headline had read, "Billionaire CEO attends gala with mysterious assistant sparks fly." She had sighed softly, knowing what would follow now. As she walked through the glass doors of Whitmore Innovations, she felt the weight of eyes on her. It wasn't cruel, not yet just curious, speculative, but curiosity, in an office like this, was the seed from which rumors grew tall and wild. She placed her bag down, opened her planner, and began the day. Emails, schedules, quarterly reports. Her hands steady even as the air around her seemed to buzz. At exactly 8:30, Ethan's door opened. He stood there, a little too still, holding his coffee like a man grasping for control. His eyes flickered toward the open office floor. He heard it too. The laughter that stopped too quickly, the sudden hush that followed his steps. "Grace," he said quietly, "could you come in for a moment inside his office?" The door closed with a soft click. The city stretched out below them, gray and bright. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "About all this?" She shook her head gently. "You don't owe me an apology, Mr. Whitmore." We both knew how people would talk. "I should have thought ahead," he murmured. "I should have known better." Her voice softened, kind but firm. "You're not responsible for what people choose to imagine." He looked at her, then not as a boss defending his reputation, but as a man trying to protect something fragile. "Still, if anyone says anything, I'll handle it," she said, cutting in gently. "You don't need to fight my battles." There was something in her tone, quiet strength again, the same calm dignity that had disarmed him at the gala. He nodded, reluctantly. As Grace turned to leave, the door opened again, this time without a knock. "Ethan." "There you are," a voice boomed, confident and practiced. It was Miles Harrington, CEO of a competing tech firm, the kind of man who wore charm like a weapon. His smile was broad, his handshake firm, his eyes quick and calculating. "Miles." Ethan greeted coolly. "Didn't know you were in Chicago." "Oh, I make it a point to drop by when the winds change," Miles said with an easy grin. His gaze flicked toward Grace, lingering just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. "And I must say, the winds around here are certainly interesting this week." Grace straightened subtly. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington." "Ah, Miss Ellison," Miles said smoothly. "You made quite an impression the other night." The entire industry's still talking about that photograph. I dare say it's the best PR Whitmore Innovations has had in months. Ethan's jaw tightened. "We prefer to let our work speak for us." "Of course you do," Miles said, grin unwavering. "But, you know the press, they love a good story. And this one's got everything beauty, mystery, and just enough scandal to keep the headlines warm. Grace's expression didn't change, but Ethan could feel the irritation rising in him, not just at Miles's words, but at the smug satisfaction behind them. After Miles left, the silence in the office felt heavier. Grace turned back to her desk, pretending not to notice the flicker of anger in Ethan's eyes. All day, he caught himself glancing toward her when she answered the phone, when she typed, when she smiled faintly at something on her screen. He told himself it was concern, a professional sense of responsibility, but deep down, he knew it was something else. Respect, yes, but also desire. And that realization unsettled him more than any rumor could. That night, as the building emptied and the city lights glittered below, Ethan remained at his desk, the echo of Miles's laughter still in his mind. He had built his life on rules, boundaries, control, reputation. Grace had always fit neatly within that structure, capable, loyal, distant enough to be safe. Now, that safety was gone. In the reflection of the window, he could almost see the photo again him, looking at her with something dangerously close to tenderness. For a man like Ethan Whitmore, emotion was the one variable he couldn't control. And as snow began to fall again over Chicago, he realized that the real danger wasn't in the gossip swirling outside his office walls. It was in the truth he was beginning to admit to himself, a truth that had quietly taken root in the space between professionalism and longing. Rumors, like winter frost, eventually lose their sharpness. But they leave traces of chill that lingers even when the air begins to warm. Weeks passed since the photograph and the whispers it had sparked. By then, the office chatter had found new targets, new dramas, yet something inside Ethan Whitmore had quietly shifted. He couldn't pinpoint when it began, perhaps that night at the Palmer house, or maybe the morning he saw Grace walk through the gossip with her head high, her dignity untouched. Whatever it was, it lingered. It softened him. He started noticing small things, the way Grace smiled when she talked to the janitor in the lobby, the way she brought an extra coffee to the receptionist on cold mornings, or how she never raised her voice, even when the day frayed around the edges. Her steadiness wasn't passive. It was strength in disguise. One evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, Ethan looked up from a pile of reports and found her still at her desk. The office lights had dimmed, leaving the city glow to spill across the windows. "Grace," he said, stepping out of his office. "It's past 9. You should go home." She smiled without looking up. "Just finishing the quarterly files. I'll be out soon." He hesitated. "You've been working late all week." She finally looked at him, her expression calm but tired. Sometimes it's easier to stay busy. There was something in her voice that caught him, something quiet, aching, but dignified. He wanted to ask more, but years of emotional distance held him back. So, instead, he nodded and said softly, "Don't forget to rest." That night, he didn't leave right away. He sat at his desk, staring at the city lights, realizing how much he didn't know about her. Grace had been beside him for nearly a decade, 8 years of order and reliability. Yet she was, in many ways, a mystery. The next morning, as he waited for his coffee, he overheard 2 assistants talking near the elevator. "I ran into Grace at the pharmacy last night," one of them said. "She was picking up medication for her father. Poor thing, he's struggling with dementia." Ethan froze, his hand still hovering near the coffee pot. He hadn't known. Later that day, he noticed how Grace's phone lit up during a meeting, a name flashing Dad's nurse. She silenced it quickly, apologizing. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly afterward. She nodded, forcing a small smile. "Just checking in." He has good days and bad ones. Something inside Ethan shifted again, a quiet, unfamiliar ache. He'd spent years managing numbers, projects, acquisitions. But this was something different. This was humanity. That weekend, without telling her, he made a few phone calls. Through one of his charitable contacts, He arranged for additional home care support in her neighborhood anonymously, of course. When Grace later mentioned that her father's new nurse was a godsend just when things were getting hard, Ethan only nodded, hiding the faintest smile. The following weeks unfolded like a slow thaw. Small gestures began to replace his usual indifference. He started keeping an extra cup of her favorite dark roast coffee on his desk during early meetings. He held elevator doors. Once, he even insisted on walking her to her car when an icy wind cut through the parking garage. Grace noticed, though she never mentioned it. She simply accepted his kindness with quiet grace, sensing the intention beneath it, not pity, but respect. One late evening, as snow drifted past the tall glass windows, she found him still at his desk, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. The sight was oddly humanizing. He looked up from his laptop, eyes tired but softer than she'd ever seen. "You're still here?" she said gently. He smiled faintly. "You sound surprised." "I didn't think billionaires worked this late." He laughed genuinely this time, low and quiet. Only the ones who were trying to be better than they were yesterday. Her expression softened. "You are changing, you know." He raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" She nodded. "You listen more. You smile sometimes. You even remember to eat lunch." He chuckled. "Is that your way of saying I used to be unbearable?" Grace tilted her head thoughtfully. "Not unbearable, just unreachable." Her words landed gently but deeply. For a moment, neither spoke. The city's hum filled the space between them, car lights flickering below, snow swirling against the glass. "Grace," he said finally, voice lower now, "how do you do it? Stay so steady. When life keeps throwing storms at you." She paused, then looked at him with quiet honesty. "You learn to stop fighting the rain, Mr. Whitmore. You just keep walking through it, one step at a time." He sat back, letting her words settle. In a life built on control, her simplicity struck him as profound. After she left that night, Ethan remained by the window long after midnight, the lights of Chicago stretching endlessly below. He thought of her father, her son, the strength it must take to hold it all together with such grace. He realized then that leadership wasn't just about control or vision. It was about compassion, the courage to see beyond numbers and titles into the quiet struggles that shape people. In the weeks that followed, his staff began to notice the change. The once distant CEO now stopped to ask how their mornings were going. He brought fresh flowers into the reception area. He even canceled a high-profile meeting one Friday afternoon so that the team could leave early after a grueling quarter. Grace said nothing, but she noticed everything. And though she didn't know it yet, her quiet presence had become the compass that was slowly pointing Ethan Whitmore back towards something he hadn't felt in years: humanity. By early spring, the office air had softened. The frost between them had melted into something gentler, unspoken yet undeniable. And as Grace left one evening, coat draped over her arm, she caught his reflection in the glass, a man no longer made entirely of winter. By the time spring rolled into early summer, the city had shed its cold gray skin. Chicago's streets hummed with new life, open windows, lilac air, and the kind of light that made people linger on sidewalks just to feel it on their faces. Inside Whitmore Innovations, the tension that once lived in every hallway had softened. Ethan had changed subtly, but unmistakably. His tone was gentler, his temper slower to rise. And when Grace entered a room, he didn't just notice her presence, he seemed steadied by it. But life, as it often does, was preparing its next lesson. When the annual corporate leadership retreat was announced, a long weekend of strategy sessions and team building at a private estate in Sonoma Valley, Grace volunteered to handle logistics, flights, lodging, transportation, all the details that kept everything running smoothly. She didn't expect to go herself, but a last-minute cancellation left an open seat, and Ethan insisted she take it. "You've earned it," he said simply, "and I could use someone I trust on this trip." So, on a bright Friday morning, they flew west away from the steel and glass of Chicago toward the rolling vineyards and sun-drenched calm of California wine country. The Sonoma estate was the kind of place that seemed to breathe slower, a 19th century villa perched on a hill, wrapped in grapevines and golden light. Stone terraces overlooked valleys that stretched endlessly, dotted with oak trees and soft clouds of mist. The air smelled of lavender and earth and something like peace, but peace, it turned out, was in short supply when they arrived. "There's been a mix-up with the rooms," the event coordinator explained apologetically. "We're completely full. The only suite left is the executive one, double occupancy." Ethan's brows lifted slightly. "You mean, yes, sir, you and Miss Ellison would have to share." Grace felt her pulse catch. The professional in her immediately offered, "I can find a hotel nearby." But the nearest hotel was 20 miles away, and the roads wound through dark country hills. Ethan shook his head. "It's fine. We'll make it work." He turned to her, voice steady but eyes uncertain. "If you're comfortable with that." Grace nodded, though her cheeks warmed faintly. "Of course. Strictly business." The suite was beautiful, all rustic charm and quiet elegance. Exposed beams, soft cream linens, and wide windows opening onto endless rows of vineyards shimmering in late afternoon gold. A single living area divided the space, with 2 bedrooms branching off in opposite directions. Professional boundaries were easy to draw in daylight, harder, perhaps, at night when the air was thick with the scent of wine and the hum of cicadas outside. The first evening passed with polite conversations, project updates, new initiatives, the usual corporate talk. But as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the valley in amber light, the formality between them began to fade. Grace stood by the terrace railing, her hair catching the last of the day's glow. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. Ethan joined her, glass of wine in hand. "I'd forgotten places like this still exist. Places where the world slows down long enough for you to notice yourself." She smiled. "That's the problem, isn't it? We build our lives so fast that we forget to live in them." He glanced at her, really looked at her, and saw not the efficient assistant who kept his empire steady, but a woman who had weathered storms and somehow remained whole. "Do you ever wish you'd chosen differently?" he asked quietly. Grace thought for a long moment. "No, my life isn't glamorous, but it's mine. Every piece of it, even the hard ones, taught me something." "What about the loneliness?" She turned to him, eyes clear. "Loneliness isn't the same as emptiness. There's dignity in learning to stand alone. You stop needing to be rescued." Her words landed gently, but they struck deep. For a man who had spent his life rescuing, fixing, controlling, managing, Ethan suddenly realized how little he'd ever understood about letting things be. As twilight deepened, they sat in companionable silence, watching the vineyards fade into blue shadow. Somewhere in the distance, someone played a soft tune on a guitar. The melody drifted up the hill like memory. Later that night, when Grace retired to her room, Ethan lingered on the terrace. He thought about what she'd said. There's dignity in standing alone. He wondered when he'd lost his own, somewhere between success and solitude. He had built walls so high that even peace couldn't climb over them. But Grace quietly, without trying, had found a way through. The next morning, the retreat continued leadership sessions, networking dinners, laughter echoing through the courtyard. But for Ethan, something had shifted. He found himself watching the world through softer eyes, noticing how people relaxed when Grace entered the room, how her steadiness grounded chaos. That evening, they walked together down a narrow path between the vineyards. The sunset stretched wide and golden, the air warm and thick with the scent of ripe grapes. Grace spoke about her father, his lucid moments, his confusion, his stubborn humor that still flickered through the fog of dementia. She told him how she sometimes missed the version of him that could still call her by name, but how she'd learned to love who he'd become anyway. Ethan listened, really listened, and for once, he didn't try to fix anything. When she finished, he said quietly, "You make strength look effortless." She shook her head. "It's not strength. Ethan, It's acceptance. You stop fighting the things you can't change, and you start loving what's left. They stood there for a moment, two people who had lived on opposite sides of solitude now sharing the same quiet sky. As they walked back to the villa, the golden light softened into dusk. Their steps fell in rhythm, easy and unspoken. That night, long after Grace had gone to her room, Ethan stood again on the terrace, the valley wrapped in silence. For the first time in years, he felt small not in defeat, but in humility. He thought about how leadership was never about power. It was about people, about seeing them, really seeing them, and letting them change you. And somewhere between the soft hum of the night and the slow rustle of the vineyard leaves, Ethan Whitmore realized that Grace Ellison hadn't just entered his life. She'd redefined it. The final night in Sonoma carried a stillness that felt almost sacred. The retreat had ended hours ago. The laughter, the wine, the polite applause after closing speeches, all of it had faded into memory. What lingered now was quiet, soft, almost tender. Outside the villa, the vineyard shimmered beneath a full moon, each leaf brushed in silver light. The air was cool, fragrant with earth and jasmine, the kind of evening that made even the most guarded souls loosen their armor. Ethan hadn't meant to find her. But when he stepped out for a walk, needing space to think, there she was. Grace standing at the edge of the vineyard, looking up at the sky as if searching for something only she could see. He hesitated for a moment, watching her from a distance. The moonlight touched her hair, turning it almost gold, and something in him, something long buried, stirred. Couldn't sleep either, he asked softly. She turned, a small smile curving her lips. Too quiet. My mind's not used to silence. He joined her, the gravel crunching lightly under his shoes. It's strange, isn't it? How silence can be louder than noise. They began walking, the path winding gently between rows of vines heavy with fruit. Above them, the stars stretched wide, and the valley pulsed with its own slow heartbeat. The hum of insects, the distant call of an owl, the faint rustle of leaves. For a while, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. It was enough to walk side by side, breathing the same cool air, the same unspoken question hanging between them. Finally, Grace said quietly, you ever wonder if loneliness is just part of being human? Ethan glanced at her. I used to think it was something to conquer, like a weakness. And now he took a breath, hands in his pockets. Now, I think maybe it's something you live with, something that reminds you you're still alive. Grace smiled faintly. You sound like a man who's learned that the hard way. He laughed softly. I suppose I have. Then, after a pause, when you said there's dignity in standing alone, it made me think, I've spent my whole life surrounded by people but never really known how to be with them. Success was easy, connection wasn't. Her steps slowed. Connection takes courage, she said, more than success ever will. He looked at her, then really looked. The quiet strength in her eyes, the calm that came from surviving storms instead of avoiding them. You're brave, he said. Grace shook her head gently. No, I'm just tired of being afraid. The honesty between them cracked something open, something delicate and raw. They stopped walking, the moonlight spilling across their faces. Ethan spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. You've changed me, Grace. She met his gaze, steady but soft. No, Ethan, you were just ready to see yourself differently. A long silence followed, not heavy, but alive. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. He took a step closer, then another, until he could feel the warmth of her just inches away. He hesitated, every part of him, conditioned to stay in control, but control had lost its meaning tonight. I don't want to cross a line, he said quietly. Grace's eyes didn't waver, then maybe stop thinking in lines. The words were soft, but they unmade him. And then, as the wind sighed through the vines and the moon watched from above, he reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it found hers. She didn't pull away. Their first kiss wasn't dramatic or practiced. It was hesitant, tender. The meeting of two people who had spent too long pretending they didn't need what they'd just found. For Ethan, the world stopped moving. There were no boardrooms, no contracts, no headlines, only the taste of wine on her lips, the warmth of her hand, and the sound of her breath mingling with his. When they finally pulled apart, the silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was full of everything neither of them had dared to say. Grace looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "We can't let this change everything," she said, though her voice betrayed how deeply it already had. He nodded slowly. "I know, but knowing and stopping were two different things." They walked back toward the villa, side by side again, though now something invisible linked them, fragile, real, undeniable. At the terrace steps, she turned to him. "Ethan," he met her gaze, heart unsteady. "This can't be about rescue," she said softly, "or about need. If it ever becomes that, it'll break us both." He nodded, understanding more than he could say. "It's not about rescue," he whispered. "It's about seeing you maybe for the first time." She smiled, small but true, then slipped inside, leaving him alone under the moonlight. He stood there for a long while, the night pressing gently against his chest, the scent of her perfume still lingering in the cool air. For once, Ethan Whitmore wasn't thinking about his company, or his image, or the carefully built walls of his world. He was thinking about her, the woman who had taught him that courage wasn't in control, but in letting go. And as the moon hung high above the quiet valley, Ethan realized that somewhere between solitude and connection, he had finally begun to feel alive. When they returned from Sonoma, the rhythm of the city felt harsher, sharper somehow, as if Chicago itself had lost its patience for tenderness. The vineyards and golden sunsets were gone, replaced by glass towers, schedules, and the relentless pulse of ambition. Yet something fragile had followed them home. It wasn't spoken, and it didn't need to be. The air between them, once distant, purely professional, now carried the quiet pulse of something real. They had agreed to act as if nothing had changed, to keep boundaries, to protect what they both valued: their work, their dignity, their fragile peace. But hearts rarely obey rules written by the mind. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found himself distracted, his focus slipping during meetings, his thoughts wandering to Grace's laughter, echoing through the vineyards, the way her hand had felt in his beneath the moonlight. He fought it, of course. He always fought what he couldn't control. Grace, too, returned to her routines with measured calm, but she could feel the undercurrent between them, invisible, undeniable. She'd catch his eyes across the conference table, and for a fleeting moment, there would be warmth there. Then he'd look away, back into the armor of his work. It might have continued like that, quiet, careful, unresolved if not for the storm that arrived without warning. It began on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that looked ordinary: gray sky, coffee steam, the usual buzz of office life, until the email came. A confidential data breach had been detected within Whitmore Innovations, sensitive files accessed from an internal account. The IT department flagged it within hours, and the account, it belonged to Grace Ellison. At first, no one believed it. Not really. Grace was the backbone of integrity. She lived by order, precision, loyalty, but the evidence was there, at least, on the surface. There were emails traced from her company address, supposedly sent to an external domain, security footage showing her entering the records department after hours, a trail of digital fingerprints that seemed impossible to dispute. By noon, whispers were spreading like wildfire. "She's in trouble," someone murmured by the elevators. "I heard she leaked client data to a competitor. Unbelievable. I thought she was the perfect assistant." In his office, Ethan stared at the report in disbelief, his pulse hammering. None of it made sense. Grace betray him, betray the company. He called it directly. There must be a mistake. He insisted. Check again. Every file. Every timestamp. The head of IT sighed on the other end. We've checked twice, Mr. Whitmore. I'm sorry, but the logs are clear. Someone using her credentials sent those files. Grace was summoned to HR within the hour. When she walked through the corridor, the same corridor where she'd once been admired for her composure and grace, now eyes followed her with suspicion. Her steps were steady, her expression calm, but there was a quiet devastation in the way she held her notebook like a shield. Inside HR, she faced 3 people, a compliance officer, a lawyer, and a manager she'd known for years. The questions came softly at first, then sharper. Did you access the secured database on Friday night? No, she said firmly. I was home. Then how do you explain the activity from your account? Grace swallowed, her voice steady. Someone must have used my login. I never share my credentials. Her words were met with polite skepticism, the kind that says we've already decided what we believe. When Ethan arrived at the door, HR tried to stop him. Sir, it's best you stay out of this for now. Conflict of interest. But he ignored them. He walked in, eyes dark with fury. This is absurd, he said, his tone cutting through the tension. Grace Ellison has been with this company for 8 years. She's loyal, meticulous. She wouldn't risk her career, or mine, over something like this. The HR manager cleared his throat. We understand your concern, Mr. Whitmore, but the evidence is compelling. Until the investigation concludes, we have to follow protocol. Protocol? Ethan repeated bitterly. You mean suspension? Grace spoke before he could say more. It's all right, she said softly. Let them do their job. He turned to her, incredulous. You can't just accept this. Her eyes met his calm, steady, heartbreakingly resigned. Fighting won't help right now. But he could see it in her face, the quiet humiliation, the disbelief that years of loyalty could be undone so easily. That afternoon, the board convened behind closed doors. They advised Ethan firmly, professionally, to keep his distance. Your involvement could compromise the investigation, one of them said, and given recent gossip, any appearance of favoritism could damage both of you. He knew they were right. He hated that they were right. That evening, as the office emptied, Ethan sat alone in the dark, the city lights flickering beyond the glass. He thought of all the times Grace had stayed late to fix his mistakes, the quiet competence that had kept his empire intact, the way she'd looked at him that night in Sonoma, full of truth and tenderness. And now, she was being torn apart by lies. He felt anger rise not just at the injustice, but at himself. He'd let her walk into a world built on his name, trusting that his protection meant something. Now that trust had been weaponized against her. He suspected Miles Harrington almost immediately. The timing, the precision, it all fit. Miles had been circling his company for months, his rivalry disguised as charm. But suspicion wasn't proof, and without proof, Ethan's hands were tied. For a man who lived by control, this helplessness was unbearable. Later that night, he sat in his car outside Grace's apartment, the engine idling, the city rain blurring his reflection in the windshield. He wanted to go up, to tell her he believed her, to fight. But the same fear that had ruled him for years, the fear of losing everything he'd built, held him still. Inside that car, torn between the man he'd been and the one Grace had begun to awaken, Ethan Whitmore faced the quiet battle that would define him. Follow the rules, or fight for her. And as the rain whispered against the glass, he realized that sometimes betrayal doesn't come from others. It comes from the part of yourself that stays silent when love is on the line. The following days unfolded in slow motion, as if time itself had lost its rhythm. The scandal that began as whispers now filled the air like smoke, impossible to clear. Grace's name lingered in every hallway, spoken in tones too polite to be kind. Ethan had tried everything he could within the narrow boundaries left to him, quiet inquiries, discreet favors, sleepless nights spent combing through data logs himself. But The board's message had been clear: do not interfere. By Friday morning, the decision came down. Grace Ellison was to be placed on paid administrative leave pending further investigation. The HR representative delivered the news in that carefully neutral tone reserved for corporate tragedy. Grace simply nodded, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm, though her eyes gave her away. They were tired in a way that came from betrayal, not work. Ethan wasn't in the room when she was told. Company policy forbade it. But when he heard, he closed his office door and stood by the window for a long time, his reflection staring back at him, cold, motionless, utterly useless. He wanted to call her, to tell her he believed her, that none of this made sense. But every time he reached for the phone, his hand froze. Words felt inadequate against what she was losing. And perhaps worse, he was forbidden to speak them. That evening, Grace returned to her desk to pack her things. The office was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above her. She moved carefully, methodically, the same way she had worked every day for 8 years. A framed photo of her son, a small potted plant she'd nursed from a cutting. A worn notebook filled with her looping handwriting reminders, quotes, notes for meetings that would now never happen. Each item she placed in the box felt like a small goodbye to a life she had built piece by piece. Outside the glass wall of her cubicle, the city's skyline glowed cold and magnificent. She paused to look at it one last time. The view had always been the same, but tonight it felt distant, unreachable. She thought of Ethan, of his silence. She didn't blame him, not really. He was trapped, too, by his name, his power, his reputation. But a part of her, the small, fragile part that still believed in the goodness of people, had hoped he would find a way. In another part of the building, Ethan stood in his office, watching from behind the tinted glass. He couldn't see her face clearly, only the silhouette of her moving slowly through the room. The sight hollowed him. Every instinct screamed to go to her, to break the rules, to tell her the truth that he trusted her more than anyone, that this entire company would be nothing without her. But all he could do was stand there, paralyzed by duty and fear. He pressed his hand against the window, as if the glass could somehow bridge the distance between them. Down below, Grace closed the lid on her box. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. She stepped inside, holding her coat close to her chest. When the doors slid shut, Ethan turned away, unable to watch them close. That night, the city rain returned, soft at first, then steady, washing the sidewalks clean. In 2 different apartments, miles apart, 2 people sat awake in the dark. Grace sat by her kitchen window, listening to the rain against the glass. The apartment felt too quiet, too still. Her father was asleep in the next room, his soft breathing the only sound that kept her anchored. She should have felt anger, but what she felt instead was emptiness, the heavy silence that comes when you've done everything right and still lost. Across town, Ethan sat in his penthouse, the lights of the city stretching below him like a constellation he couldn't name. His phone lay on the table, her number glowing softly on the screen. He picked it up, then put it down, then picked it up again. The phone never rang. He poured himself a drink scotch, neat, and let the burn remind him he was still human. He told himself there would be a time to make things right, a time to fix this. But deep down, he knew the damage had already been done. At midnight, he walked to the window, looking out at the storm. Somewhere, he imagined Grace doing the same, staring at the same rain, under the same sky, both of them trapped in their own silences. If fate were kind, he thought, it would allow him one more chance to say what he hadn't. But fate rarely concerned itself with kindness. Days later, her desk was cleared, her name removed from the company directory. The office felt colder, emptier. Even the air seemed different, less human somehow. People moved on, as people do. New rumors rose to replace the old ones. But for Ethan, the echo of her absence lingered in every corner. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk through the office after everyone had gone home. He'd stop by her old desk, the faint ring of sunlight on the surface where her plant used to sit. He'd rest his hand there, as if the memory could still be warm. That was where he was one evening, standing in silence. When he saw it, a small folded note wedged beneath the keyboard. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was hers. "Thank you for letting me build something worth believing in. Take care of it and of yourself." No signature, just those words. Ethan folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He stood there for a long moment, then turned off the lights. As the elevator doors closed behind him, he finally understood something Grace had once said. Loneliness isn't the same as emptiness. There's dignity in learning to stand alone. He had never understood it until now, that night, in the reflection of the glass as the rain fell over Chicago. Two lives mirrored one another, separate, silent. Both changed beyond repair. And for the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore felt what it truly meant to lose something that mattered. Winter had loosened its grip by the time truth finally arrived. 3 long months had passed since Grace walked out of Whitmore Innovations for the last time. Her box of belongings clutched against her chest like a quiet farewell. The world had moved on, or at least, it pretended to. Projects resumed, markets stabilized. The board congratulated itself on swift damage control. And the company, in its polished detachment, did what corporations always do when faced with human loss. It absorbed the story, scrubbed the headlines, and continued forward. But not everyone moved on. Ethan Whitmore lived inside a silence that stretched farther than the walls of his penthouse could hold. Each morning began the same way. Coffee untouched, a headline glowing on his tablet. Whitmore Innovations recovers after internal scandal. The article praised his leadership, his steady hand during crisis, the company's record profits. There were even new investors, new opportunities. On paper, he was winning. In life, he was unraveling. The investigation had concluded 2 weeks earlier. A report thick, impersonal, definitive landed on his desk. It detailed how the supposed data breach had been fabricated. The evidence pointing to Grace was falsified, the security footage edited, the emails forged. A digital trail traced back, not to her, but to an offshore server linked to Miles Harrington's corporate network. Grace was innocent, entirely, undeniably. Ethan had read the final page twice, then a third time, as if repetition could undo what had already been done. But by the time the truth surfaced, she was gone. Her phone disconnected, her apartment vacated. The only trace she left behind was the note he still carried in his jacket pocket, folded so many times it had begun to wear at the edges. He thought of calling her, of flying to wherever she'd gone, of saying the words he should have said months ago. "I believe you. I'm sorry. I should have fought for you." But every time he picked up the phone, the silence on the other end felt heavier than the courage he needed to dial. Nights were the worst. He would come home to the penthouse, the same sleek, immaculate space that once symbolized his success, and feel nothing but its emptiness. The city glittered below, indifferent. He would pour himself a glass of scotch, then another, waiting for sleep that never came. Sometimes, he'd walk to the window, the glass cold beneath his palm, and imagine her reflection beside his the way she used to stand just behind him in meetings, quietly grounding him when the world demanded too much. Now, even the echo of her presence was gone. His colleagues noticed the change, though no one dared to name it. His meetings grew shorter, his words fewer. He no longer barked orders or filled silences with strategy. He simply drifted through his days like a man operating on memory alone. The truth of Grace's innocence should have brought him relief. Instead, it brought only guilt sharp and merciless. Because the scandal hadn't just been an attack on her integrity, it had been a test of his. And he had failed it. He had chosen silence over courage, protocol over heart, reputation over truth. And now, every success felt hollow, every victory tainted. On a late March evening, he sat alone by the fireplace, the city lights flickering through the rain. A headline flashed again across the muted television. Whitmore Innovations regains investor confidence after internal audit. He stared at it for a long moment before reaching for the remote and switching it off. The silence that followed was deafening. He poured another drink, the amber liquid catching the firelight. His reflection shimmered faintly on the window's surface, a man still admired by the world, but one who no longer recognized himself. It was in moments like this that Grace's voice would return to him, not as sound, but as memory. There's dignity in learning to stand alone. He finally understood what she'd meant. Standing alone wasn't strength, it was consequence. He had built a fortress out of rules and reason, and when love had come, knocking fragile, human, real, he'd locked the door. Outside, thunder rolled over Lake Michigan, low and distant. Ethan stood and crossed to his desk. The investigation report lay open where he'd left it, the company seal stamped in neat blue ink. He read the closing statement again. Ellison is hereby cleared of all accusations. Case closed. He closed the folder, slid it into a drawer, and turned off the light. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling as the city slowly brightened outside. When the first light touched the edges of the window, he realized something simple, something devastating. Grace had never really been the one on trial. He had been found guilty not by a board or a court, but by his own heart. In the weeks that followed, Ethan stopped attending social events. He declined interviews. He stayed away from the spotlight he'd once craved. The world read his silence as focus, but those who looked closely, the rare few who still cared, saw the truth. He was haunted by a woman who had taught him kindness through her calm, strength through her grace, and love through her absence. Some nights, when the insomnia became unbearable, he would drive through the quiet streets of the city, past the lake, past the old neighborhoods where the lights glowed warm and human. Once, he even drove past Grace's old apartment building, the one with the peeling white shutters. The window where she used to keep her lamp lit late into the night was dark now. He sat there for a long time, engine idling, watching the shadows move across the brick wall. Then, quietly, he whispered into the dark, "I'm sorry." The words disappeared into the wind. Back home, the silence waited faithful, suffocating, complete. He walked to the window, looked out at the skyline he'd conquered, and felt nothing but the weight of everything he'd lost. In that vast, empty penthouse, success echoed like an accusation, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Whitmore understood that a man could have everything: wealth, power, prestige, and still be utterly, painfully hollow inside. Spring crept quietly across the country that year, hesitant, fragile, like a promise that wasn't sure it wanted to be kept. In Chicago, the snow had melted into gray slush along the curbs. But in Charleston, South Carolina, the magnolias had already begun to bloom. The air there smelled of salt and jasmine, and the ocean wind carried with it something Chicago never did: forgiveness. Grace Ellison hadn't planned to stay in Charleston. She'd gone there in search of quiet, a temporary escape, a place to catch her breath after the storm. But the city had a way of holding people gently, asking nothing, offering only sunlight and time. 3 months became 6. 6 became a year. By then, Grace had rebuilt not just her life, but her faith in herself. It started with a simple favor, helping a friend navigate a small PR crisis for her family-owned business. Grace had always been good in a storm. Her years under Ethan Whitmore had taught her how to think clearly when others panicked, how to read a room, how to restore order to chaos. Word spread. One client became 3, then 10, then a dozen, within a year. She opened her own firm, a small office tucked between a row of restored townhouses on King Street. She called it Ellison Strategies, not flashy, not corporate, just honest. Her tagline read, "When the storm hits, we help you stand again." The name made her smile every time she saw it. Her days found rhythm again, morning coffee at the same cafe near the harbor, the scent of roasted beans mingling with sea air. Afternoons filled with meetings, laughter, a small team that felt more like family than staff. Grace had traded skyscrapers for church bells, high heels for sandaled walks along the Battery at dusk. And in doing so, she'd found something she hadn't realized: she'd lost peace. The locals adored her. She had a way of listening that made people feel seen, of speaking that made them feel capable. She didn't command rooms, she anchored them. And though she rarely spoke about her past, those who worked beside her sensed the weight of it and the quiet wisdom it had carved into her. One of her early clients was a small tech startup led by a young founder whose company had nearly collapsed after a breach of data. When he confessed through tears that he thought his career was over, Grace had smiled softly and said, "It's not the fall that defines you. It's what you do when you stand back up." Her words were simple, but they carried the kind of truth that only comes from living it. At night, when the office lights dimmed and the last staffer went home, Grace would often sit by her window, the city lights reflecting off the water. Sometimes, she still thought of Chicago, not the scandal, not the pain, but the man who had once taught her to believe in her own voice. Even if he hadn't found his, she didn't hate Ethan. She couldn't. There was too much understanding between them for that. What she felt was something softer, a kind of bittersweet gratitude. He had, without meaning to, pushed her toward her truest self. She'd learned that survival wasn't about rebuilding what was lost. It was about creating something new in its place. While Grace was finding her footing in Charleston, Ethan remained in Chicago, surrounded by everything success could buy, and nothing that felt like life. He read about her in a business magazine one afternoon, purely by accident. The article was titled, "From Scandal to Strategy: The Woman Redefining Crisis Management in the South." Her photograph accompanied the peace sunlight on her hair, a quiet confidence in her smile. He read every word twice, then again. The article described her company's philosophy: transparency, empathy, resilience. Words that used to sound soft to him, impractical in the ruthless world of business, now read like truth. For the first time in months, he smiled. She looked happy. Not performatively, not strategically, genuinely happy. He closed the magazine and leaned back in his chair. The office felt colder, emptier somehow, the sterile white walls pressing in. For a long time, he sat there, thinking of how differently their lives had unfolded. Grace had built something with soul. He had built something with structure. And between the two, it was soul that had survived. That night, Ethan walked through his penthouse, lights low, scotch in hand. The skyline glittered through the windows, beautiful but unfeeling. His success had become a mirror, reflecting back only his isolation. Meanwhile, in Charleston, Grace was at a small community event, a fundraiser for families affected by hurricane damage. She wasn't the speaker, just a quiet helper, arranging name tags, handing out coffee, listening to stories. When the mayor thanked her publicly for donating her firm's services to local nonprofits, she smiled modestly. "You don't rebuild cities with money," she said into the microphone. "You rebuild them with people who still believe in goodness." Applause filled the hall, warm and genuine. Grace looked out over the crowd faces full of hope, gratitude, resilience, and felt something inside her settle. She had once defined herself by her job, her loyalty, her ability to hold everything together for someone else. But now, she belonged to herself. The woman who once walked through marble offices in silence now walked barefoot on Carolina sand, laughing with her small team over late dinners. Their lives intertwined not by ambition, but by shared purpose. In the quiet of her new home, a restored townhouse near the waterfront, Grace sometimes still worked late. But the glow that filled her office wasn't the cold fluorescence of corporate ceilings. It was the soft, golden light of lamps, the scent of magnolia drifting through open windows, and the hum of crickets beyond the porch. Her father's condition had stabilized. Her son, Noah, visited on weekends, taller now, talking about college and the world waiting ahead. Life, she realized, had a rhythm of loss and renewal, and both had a place in the music. While Ethan drowned in the hollow echo of success, Grace Ellison once accused, once broken, had learned the art of beginning again, not by chasing what she lost, but by embracing what remained. The world would call it reinvention. Grace would simply call it coming home. For weeks after that article, Ethan kept the magazine tucked inside his briefcase, folded, creased, its edges softening from being handled too often. He told himself it was coincidence, that he had only meant to glance at it once, but he found himself reading it again late at night, long after the city had gone quiet. Grace's story stirred something in him, not envy, not even nostalgia, but awakening. She had taken her pain and turned it into purpose. He, on the other hand, had taken his success and built a fortress around it. In his penthouse office high above Michigan Avenue, the city looked the same, as always dazzling, indifferent, fast. But to Ethan, it had begun to feel hollow, like a stage set waiting for meaning. He poured himself another cup of coffee, the skyline flickering beyond the window, and whispered to no one. She found her way out. Maybe it's time I find mine. That thought, small, quiet, but persistent, grew roots. For years, Whitmore Innovations had been a machine, sleek, profitable, relentless. It had built Ethan's fortune and fed his ego, but it had never fed his soul. He had once believed that power could protect him from regret, that success could disguise emptiness. Now, he knew better, and so, one Monday morning, Ethan Whitmore walked into his own boardroom with a look his executives had never seen before, calm, certain, and resolute. Effective immediately, he said, "We're restructuring Whitmore Innovations." A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Restructuring, his CFO asked. In what sense? In every sense. Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped. We've spent years chasing growth for growth's sake, but what have we built that actually matters? A silence followed, uneasy and thick. He continued, voice steady. We're going to shift focus from profit to purpose. I want our research, our resources, and our capital to serve people, not just markets. I want to create something that outlives quarterly reports, something that heals instead of exploits. The head of marketing blinked, confused. Are you suggesting philanthropy a foundation? Not philanthropy, Ethan said. Accountability, a social innovation division, real-world problem-solving healthcare tech, educational equity, community programs. We'll start dismantling the parts of this empire that don't serve that mission. The room erupted. You're talking about cutting revenue streams. You'll tank our market value. The shareholders will revolt. Ethan listened quietly, patiently, until the noise swelled into chaos. Then, with surprising gentleness, he said, maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. A stunned silence fell again. He looked around the table, meeting each face the same faces that had once celebrated his ambition, now bewildered by his conscience. I built this company to prove I could, he said softly, but somewhere along the way, I forgot why I wanted to build anything at all. He paused, the memory of Grace's calm voice echoing in his mind. You stop fighting the things you can't change, and you start loving what's left. For the first time, he understood what she'd meant. The board meeting stretched into hours. Arguments sharpened, tempers flared. His advisors warned him that investors would walk, that his reputation would suffer. But Ethan didn't flinch. When the last voice had quieted, he stood. Gentlemen, I've spent most of my life making sure people fear disappointing me. I think it's time I learned what it feels like to disappoint them for the right reasons. He left the room to the sound of murmurs and disbelief. In the weeks that followed, the transformation began not as a corporate rebranding, but as a reckoning. Ethan sold off one of the company's largest divisions, using the funds to establish the Whitmore Foundation, an organization devoted to crisis recovery and workforce rehabilitation. It was a bold move, one that sent shockwaves through the industry. Analysts called it reckless. Investors called it naive. But for the first time, Ethan didn't care. He was no longer chasing legacy. He was chasing meaning. He began spending time in neighborhoods his company had once ignored, visiting schools, community centers, small businesses struggling to stay afloat. He sat with people who had nothing to offer him but honesty, and from them, he learned more about leadership than decades in boardrooms had ever taught him. One afternoon, while touring a local job training center his foundation had funded, he spoke with a young single mother who had just completed her certification in coding. "You don't know what this means to me," she said, eyes bright. "Someone finally gave us a chance." Ethan smiled softly. "No," he said, "you gave yourself a chance. We just built the door." He drove home that evening with the windows down, the wind cold against his face. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Not triumph, not relief, just peace. Back at the office, the board continued to resist. They called emergency meetings, demanded he reconsider. "You're dismantling everything you've built," one executive warned. Ethan leaned back, quiet but firm. But maybe everything I built was just a scaffold, something to climb higher until I could finally see what mattered." The man across from him shook his head. "You'll lose everything." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time I learn what everything really means." That night, he stayed late in his office, papers spread across his desk, blueprints for the new foundation, outlines of education grants, sustainability projects, mental health programs for employees. He worked with a kind of devotion that felt new, cleaner. When the city lights began to fade into dawn, he looked up from his work and saw his reflection in the glass. He didn't see the old Ethan Whitmore, the man of steel and solitude. He saw someone quieter, someone human. He thought again of Grace, not with longing, but with gratitude. She had once told him that compassion wasn't weakness. It was courage in softer clothing. And now he believed her. The headlines that followed were divided. Some praised his vision, others mocked it. "The billionaire with a conscience," one read. Another sneered, "Has Whitmore lost his edge?" He read them all with a quiet smile. Let them say what they would. For the first time in his life, Ethan Whitmore wasn't living to be admired. He was living to be useful, and somewhere, in the soft salt air of Charleston. He hoped perhaps she would hear of it too. Change, when it's real, doesn't come with fanfare. It arrives quietly in the small, unseen choices a person makes when no one is watching. Months passed after Ethan transformed Whitmore Innovations into a foundation for social good. The media eventually stopped speculating about his motives. The board stopped fighting his decisions. And the world, as it always does, found new stories to chase. But for Ethan, something deeper had begun. The public saw a billionaire redeemed, a man rebuilding his legacy with compassion. What they didn't see was the private silence behind that transformation, the long nights when he'd sit alone in his study, staring at her name printed in black ink on that old magazine page. Grace Ellison, founder, mentor, survivor. Her life had become the very thing he was trying to understand, the quiet strength to start over, the grace to forgive without forgetting. One morning, while reviewing a list of nonprofit partners, Ethan noticed a small entry, Ellison Strategies Community Fund, Charleston, SC. He clicked on the report. The foundation had recently launched a scholarship program for young adults whose families had lost everything in natural disasters. The goal was simple: to help them rebuild their lives through education and opportunity. There was a photo attached, Grace standing with 3 students, smiling beneath the live oaks. No cameras, no spotlights, just sunlight filtering through moss and a group of people who looked seen, not saved. Ethan stared at the image for a long time. Then, quietly, he made a decision. That evening, under the soft hum of city lights, he drafted a wire transfer. The amount was significant enough to expand her foundation for years, but he didn't attach his name. The funds came from an anonymous donor, listed only as a friend of the future. When the transaction cleared, he sat back, letting out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was a gesture, a quiet way of saying thank you for teaching him what integrity looked like when no one was applauding. Weeks later, Grace received the news during a staff meeting. Her assistant handed her the letter, official, neatly worded, with the logo of the Charleston Community Bank. She read it once, then again, her hands trembling slightly. An anonymous endowment, 7 figures, the largest donation her foundation had ever received. The letter ended simply, "For the work that heals what ambition once broke." Grace sat in silence, eyes stinging. She didn't need a signature to know. That night, as the sun fell over the harbor and the city lights flickered to life, she stood by her office window, holding the letter. A faint smile touched her lips, soft, knowing, and deeply human, across hundreds of miles, in a Chicago office where the skyline glittered like glass and regret. Ethan poured himself a glass of water instead of scotch. The habits of redemption he'd learned were built one choice at a time. He didn't tell anyone about the donation, not his board, not his advisors. Some gestures, he believed, should live in the space between 2 hearts, not 2 headlines, but fate, unpredictable as always, had its own plans. A month later, a journalist from The Atlantic reached out for a feature story. The topic: corporate transformation, how billionaires were redefining success. Ethan hesitated at first. He'd avoided interviews since the scandal years before, but something in him wanted to speak not about business, but about truth. The interviewer, a woman named Elise, was sharp but kind. She asked about his shift in philosophy, about the Whitmore Foundation's rapid growth, about his unexpected turn toward philanthropy. Halfway through, she paused and asked softly, "What made you change?" Ethan looked down, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Then he said quietly, "I once lost someone because I mistook control for love. And when she left, I realized I'd built an empire but forgotten how to be human." Elise didn't speak. She just listened. He continued, "For years, I thought success meant order, power, precision, control, but love, compassion, they don't live in control, they live in surrender." And it took losing her to understand that. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the recorder. A week later, the article went live. The headline read, "Ethan Whitmore, the man who rebuilt his empire by learning to feel." But it was the subheading that caught the world's attention. "I once lost someone because I mistook control for love." The story spread fast not because it was scandalous, but because it was honest. A man known for perfection had dared to admit imperfection. A titan of industry had spoken about tenderness. Cable shows debated it. Newspapers praised his candor. Online forums buzzed with words like growth, humility, and redemption. But Ethan didn't read the comments. He wasn't chasing approval anymore. In Charleston, Grace came across the article by accident, scrolling through headlines while waiting for a meeting. She saw his face, older now, his eyes carrying a kind of peace she hadn't seen before. She read his words slowly, her heart tightening with every line. When she reached the quote, "I once lost someone because I mistook control for love," she closed her laptop gently and looked out the window. The magnolias were blooming again. For a long moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the scent of spring. It wasn't sadness she felt, not anymore. It was something quieter. Completion. Maybe understanding. She whispered into the still air, "You finally learned." And somewhere, though miles apart. Ethan felt that same quiet understanding settle in his chest, the kind that doesn't need words or presence, only truth. From that day forward, his story no longer belonged to the world of business headlines or redemption arcs. It belonged to something larger, the simple, enduring lesson that love, when misunderstood, can wound deeply, but when redeemed, can heal far beyond the heart that first broke. The weeks that followed Ethan's article felt strangely still, as if time itself had paused to take a breath. For the first time in years, he no longer lived inside a storm of ambition. His days unfolded quietly, morning coffee on the balcony, walks along the river, afternoons spent at the foundation reviewing projects that now felt like extensions of something sacred. He wasn't chasing redemption anymore. He was simply living it. Yet, even in that calm, there was an echo a soft hum beneath the peace. Grace's name, her voice, the memory of her laughter carried somewhere between his heartbeats. He had sent no message, made no call. He'd done what he could, the anonymous donation, the confession in print, the public acknowledgement of his failure and his change. It wasn't meant to bring her back. It was meant to honor the part of her that had taught him what real love looked like, the kind that builds, not owns, that frees, not binds. But sometimes, the universe has a way of closing its own circles. It was early evening when the call came. He was sitting in his office, a stack of documents beside him, the city glowing amber beneath the setting sun. His phone buzzed softly on the desk, an unfamiliar number, Charleston area code. He hesitated, for one heartbeat, then two, then he answered, "Mr. Whitmore." A voice said, calm, familiar, gentle. For a moment, Ethan forgot how to breathe. Grace. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, like the world had suddenly remembered how to listen. "I wasn't sure if you'd answer," she said. "I wasn't sure if it was really you," he replied softly. "It's been a long time." 2 years, she said, her voice steady but warm, almost to the weak. He smiled faintly. "You were always good with details." There was a small laugh on the other end, the kind that carried both distance and memory. Then she said quietly, "I read the article." He closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. "I thought you might. And I know about the scholarship," she added, "the anonymous donation." Ethan exhaled slowly. "You were never one to miss a pattern. I wasn't sure at first," she admitted. "But then I saw the note attached. For the work that heals what ambition once broke." Her voice softened, and for a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the city below him. "I know what you did, Ethan," she said finally. "But why now?" He looked out the window, at the skyline painted in gold and shadow. He could have given her 100 answers, guilt, timing, obligation, but none of those were true anymore. "Because," he said quietly, "I finally understand what love should look like." Grace didn't speak right away. He could almost hear her thinking, weighing his words with the same honesty she always had. "And what does it look like now?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "It looks like letting people be who they're meant to be. It looks like standing beside them instead of in front of them. It looks like knowing when to stay and when to step back." Her breath caught slightly on the other end, not in surprise, but in recognition. "You've changed," she said softly. "I had to," he replied. "You were right. All those years, I thought control kept things safe, but it only kept me alone." Silence again, but this one gentler, warmer. "I used to be angry," she admitted, "for a long time. Angry that you didn't fight harder for me. Angry that you listened to rules instead of your heart. I was angry too," he said quietly, "at myself. For mistaking fear for strength." Grace sighed softly. "Funny, isn't it? How love can break us, then teach us how to live." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Yes, it's a cruel teacher, but an honest one." They talked for a while about Charleston, about her foundation, about the students whose lives she'd changed. Ethan told her about his work, the people he'd met, the lessons he'd learned in humility. It wasn't nostalgia that filled the air between them, it was something purer, the shared understanding of two people who had walked through the same storm and come out on different shores. "At one point," she said quietly, "when I read your article, I didn't feel sadness. I felt peace, like we'd both finally arrived where we were meant to be." He smiled, his throat tightening. "I think that's what grace really is. Not forgiveness, but peace." Her laughter was soft, genuine. "And to think, you used to roll your eyes when I said things like that. I was a different man," he said, "maybe not a better one." She hesitated, then said, "No, Ethan, you were just unfinished." The words landed gently, like a benediction. The sun had almost set by then. His office was bathed in the pale blue of twilight. the city lights flickering to life below. "Do you ever wonder?" Grace asked after a pause. "If we learned all this too late." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Sometimes, but then I think maybe learning it at all is what matters." There was a pause, a small sigh. Then her voice, soft as a prayer. "Maybe we both learned too late, or maybe not." Neither spoke after that. They didn't need to. When the call finally ended, Ethan didn't feel emptiness this time. He felt stillness, the kind that comes when a long journey finally meets its end. He set the phone down, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. The lights shimmered like 1,000 small truths, imperfect, human, alive, somewhere hundreds of miles away, in Charleston. Grace stood on her porch beneath the soft southern stars, phone still in hand, the ocean wind brushing her hair. They were no longer part of each other's lives, but they were part of each other's story, and that, in its own quiet way, was enough. After the call, silence settled into Ethan's life again, but it was a different kind of silence this time. Not the hollow kind that echoes through loneliness, but the gentle kind that follows understanding. For the first time in years, he felt complete, not because he had reclaimed something lost, but because he had finally learned how to let it go without bitterness. Still, her voice lingered, not in the way of longing, but like a soft refrain, a familiar melody that drifted through the quiet moments of his day. He thought often about her words. Maybe we both learned too late. Or maybe not. They had circled his thoughts ever since that evening, weaving their way through his routines during board meetings, on morning walks, in the still hours just before dawn. Then, one morning, an invitation arrived. A cream-colored envelope, hand-addressed, with the faint scent of paper and sea salt. Inside, a formal card read, "Ellison Strategies Foundation. Invites you to celebrate 5 years of impact and community Charleston, South Carolina, Saturday, May 14th. He read the words twice before setting the card down. His heart caught between surprise and something quieter, awe, maybe. He didn't know if Grace had sent it herself or if someone on her team had included his name out of courtesy. Either way, the thought of her standing before a room full of people, leading with kindness instead of fear, made him realize how far she'd come, and how far he still had to go. 2 weeks later, he boarded a flight bound for Charleston. It had been years since he'd left Chicago for anything other than business. The trip felt different, lighter, almost necessary. From the airplane window, the city fell away beneath him, steel, glass, ambition fading into a patchwork of clouds. For the first time in a long while, Ethan Whitmore wasn't flying toward power. He was flying toward peace. When the plane touched down, the air felt different, warm, alive, tinged with salt. The humidity wrapped around him like a gentle reminder that the world didn't always move at the pace of skyscrapers and quarterly deadlines. Charleston unfolded before him like a living postcard, cobblestone streets, pastel houses, balconies draped in wisteria. People walked slowly here. They smiled easily. It was a city that seemed to breathe rather than rush. He checked into a small inn near the waterfront, not one of the luxury hotels he would have chosen years ago, but a modest place with old wooden floors and a view of the harbor. That night, unable to sleep, he walked through the quiet streets beneath the glow of gas lamps. Everywhere he looked, he saw pieces of her, not in a literal sense, but in the warmth of the place itself. Grace's world was here, open, humble, rooted in care. The next morning, he visited the Ellison Strategies Foundation headquarters, just a few blocks from the old market district. The building wasn't grand brick and glass, with ivy crawling up the walls, but it radiated purpose. The sign by the door read, "Restoring What's Broken." One story at a time, through the open windows, he heard laughter, young voices, full of life. Volunteers carried boxes, students typed at desks, and somewhere, a piano played softly. He didn't go inside. He couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he stood on the sidewalk across the street, watching, A group of interns passed by, one of them holding a clipboard. "Ms. Ellison's in the back office," she said to another, smiling. "She's been here since 6 this morning." He smiled faintly. Of course she had. He turned away before anyone noticed him, walking toward the water's edge. The ocean stretched wide and endless, waves folding into one another with the slow rhythm of breath. Ethan slipped off his shoes and walked along the sand, the tide cool against his feet. Each step felt like a kind of confession, one to the world and one to himself. For so long, his life had been defined by control numbers, schedules, outcomes. Everything had been measured, predictable. But standing here, with the salt air filling his lungs and the sound of the sea around him, he realized how much he'd missed simply being. He thought about Grace, how she had built her life out of compassion, not conquest, how she had turned her pain into purpose, how she had forgiven the world quietly by choosing to live in it again. He wanted to tell her how proud he was. He wanted to thank her for teaching him what courage looked like when no one was watching. But he knew this wasn't about words. Some things, he'd learned, were meant to be felt, not said. As the sun began to set, painting the horizon in gold and coral, Ethan sat down on a driftwood log. The waves lapped gently at the shore. Somewhere behind him, the city was alive with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of evening. He thought about his old life, the sterile perfection of his penthouse, the endless chase for validation. It all seemed so far away now, almost like another lifetime. For the first time, he didn't feel regret. He felt gratitude. He realized that love, in its truest form, wasn't something you possessed or even something you kept. It was something that changed you quietly, permanently, and then let you go. He closed his eyes and let the wind move through his hair, the sound of the sea blending with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Maybe this was what peace really looked like, not the absence of longing, but the presence of acceptance. He stayed there until the light faded, until the stars began to appear, one by one, over the Carolina sky. And when he finally stood to leave, he looked back at the ocean one last time and whispered softly, "Thank you." The tide carried the word away out to sea, toward the horizon, where the sky met the water in one unbroken line. Tomorrow, he would see her again, not as the man he had once been, but as the man she had helped him become. The evening of the gala arrived with the kind of beauty that only Charleston could create, soft air tinged with salt and jasmine, lanterns swaying gently under ancient oaks draped in silver Spanish moss. The courtyard of the Ellison Strategies Foundation glowed like a painting, strings of light reflecting off glasses of champagne as a jazz band played a slow, lilting tune in the corner. Ethan stood near the entrance for a long moment, just watching. He had arrived early, intentionally, hoping to slip in quietly before the crowd. But even as people mingled and laughed, his focus remained on one question that had echoed through his mind since his plane touched down. Would she want to see him? He wasn't here to reclaim anything. He told himself that over and over. He was here to witness, to see the life she had built, the one she had deserved all along. He straightened his tie, suddenly aware of how out of place he felt. The Ethan Whitmore of years ago would have owned a room like this effortlessly. But this version of him, older, quieter, more aware of his own flaws, felt something closer to humility. Then he saw her. Grace Ellison stood near the center of the courtyard, speaking with a small group of guests. She wore a gown the color of champagne, elegant, understated, glowing in the soft light. Her hair fell in gentle waves over her shoulders, and her smile, calm and unforced, carried the warmth of someone at peace. For a moment, Ethan forgot to breathe. Years had passed, but time hadn't diminished her. It had deepened her, added grace to her movements, serenity to her presence. The woman who once carried exhaustion behind her eyes now carried light. He didn't approach her immediately. He stayed back, content to watch from afar, letting the music and laughter fill the space between them. Grace's closest friend and colleague, Ana Rivera, approached her with a knowing smile. "You nervous?" she teased gently, handing her a glass of sparkling water. About the speech, Grace asked. "Maybe a little." "No, Anna said, glancing subtly toward the courtyard entrance. About him? Grace followed her gaze, and there he was. Ethan stood a few yards away, looking as if he belonged, and yet didn't, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable, his eyes searching the crowd until they found hers. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the years between them folded into nothing. Grace felt a stillness settle in her chest. Not shock, not pain, just quiet understanding. She had known, somehow, that he would come. Maybe not tonight, maybe not ever, but eventually. He would find his way to where forgiveness lived. Anna whispered, "Are you going to speak to him?" Grace smiled softly. In time, across the courtyard, Ethan watched as she turned back to her guests, her laughter blending with the music. He couldn't look away. Every sound, every movement seemed to blur around her. When the lights dimmed slightly and the soft hum of conversation faded, the host took the stage to introduce Grace. The audience applauded as she walked forward, the crowd parting around her like a tide. Ethan found a seat toward the back, his heart heavy and full all at once. Grace stood beneath the hanging lights, her voice steady, warm. 5 years ago, she began. This foundation was born out of a single belief that broken things can be rebuilt, and broken people can find their way home again. The courtyard fell silent. I didn't start this work because I had all the answers. She continued, I started it because I'd once lost everything I thought defined me. And what I learned is that loss can be a kind of beginning if you let it teach you, instead of destroy you. Her words rippled through the audience, tender and raw. She spoke not as an executive or a survivor, but as someone deeply human, someone who had walked through pain and come out softer, not harder. In this world, she said, we talk a lot about success, about power, control, achievement, but true success doesn't live there. It lives here. She placed a hand gently over her heart. It lives in the courage to start again, in the grace to forgive even when forgiveness has to begin with yourself. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He could hear her voice as if it were meant for him alone. Maybe, in some way, it was. As the crowd erupted into applause, Grace looked out over the sea of faces. And then, for a single, lingering moment, her gaze found his. No words, no gestures, just silence filled with recognition, history, and peace. He smiled small, humble, full of quiet awe. She smiled back, the kind of smile that said, "It's all right now?" Later, as guests mingled again beneath the oaks, Anna found Grace standing near the fountain, lost in thought. "You did beautifully," Anna said softly, and he looked like a man finally at rest. Grace's eyes softened. He's not the man he was. Maybe neither of us are. Anna nodded. Are you going to talk to him? Grace looked across the courtyard. Ethan stood alone near the edge of the garden, watching the band pack up their instruments, his posture unassuming, his presence gentle. Yes, she said quietly, but not to reopen the past, just to honor what it taught us. As she began to walk toward him, the lights above flickered in the warm night breeze. The jazz band played one last song, slow, nostalgic, full of longing and light. Ethan turned as she approached, his expression calm, but his eyes glimmering with something deeper gratitude, perhaps, or wonder. Neither of them spoke right away. Around them, Charleston breathed cicadas humming, laughter spilling softly from the edges of the courtyard, the world moving on in its gentle rhythm. In that space, between music and memory, two lives that had once collided in ambition and pain now met again not as unfinished business, but as living proof that time, when met with grace, can turn wounds into wisdom. Their story, once marked by silence and regret, had found its way back not to where it began, but to where it was meant to end in understanding. And as their eyes held for one last, wordless moment, the night seemed to whisper around them, carrying the truth both had spent years learning to accept that love, in its truest form, doesn't always end in possession. Sometimes, It ends in peace. The jazz had faded, the laughter too. All that remained was the gentle hum of conversation as the final guests drifted out into the Charleston night. Lanterns still glowed softly under the canopy of Spanish moss, swaying in rhythm with the sea breeze. The courtyard, once filled with applause, now held a quiet intimacy, the kind that makes even the smallest moments feel sacred. Ethan lingered near the fountain, his reflection wavering on the surface of the water. He had watched her speak, watched her glow under the soft lights like a woman who had found her truth, and for once, he hadn't wanted to interrupt it. He had simply wanted to witness it. But now, as the last notes of the band dissolved into the humid air, Grace crossed the courtyard toward him. Her heels clicked softly on the cobblestones, her steps unhurried, deliberate, still standing in corners. She teased gently when she reached him. He smiled. Old habits die hard. For a moment, neither spoke. The night wrapped around them warm, tender, alive with the scent of salt and magnolia. Somewhere in the distance, the ocean murmured against the shore, as if the world itself was listening. "You came," she said finally. "I did," he replied. "I wasn't sure I should. I wasn't sure you would," she said, her voice soft but steady. He looked at her, really looked, taking in the years that had passed, the grace that had deepened, the calm that now lived where old wounds once had. "You've built something extraordinary." "Grace," he said, "I've followed every story, every milestone. You didn't just rebuild your life, you rebuilt hope for others." She smiled faintly. "And you built a foundation that changed more than you probably realize. People speak about you differently now, not as the man who lost everything, but as the one who finally found what mattered." He nodded slowly, humbled. Maybe we both had to break to understand what we were meant to build. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two lives bound by time and forgiveness. Finally, she asked, "Why did you really come here tonight?" Ethan exhaled, his voice low. "Because I wanted to see the person I should have seen years ago. Not the assistant who kept my world in order. Not the woman I tried to protect. Just you." Grace's gaze softened, but she didn't look away. "And what do you see now?" He hesitated, searching for words that didn't sound rehearsed. "I see someone who doesn't need rescuing anymore." She tilted her head, a faint smile curving her lips. "You're right, I don't." There was no defiance in her tone, only truth. Ethan nodded, the faintest trace of sadness flickering behind his calm. "Then, let me walk beside you instead." The air between them shifted, fragile but alive. Grace looked down for a moment, her fingers brushing the edge of the fountain. "You always did have a way with words," she said softly. "But life isn't the same story we once lived. Ethan, I've learned to stand on my own now, to lead, to choose peace over promises." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here, not to rewrite the past, Grace. Just to be part of your present if there's room for me there." Her eyes lifted to his, and for a long moment, time stilled. There was no boardroom, no scandal, no distance, just two people stripped of pretense, meeting again at the edge of possibility. "You once told me," she whispered, "that control was how you kept from falling apart." He nodded. "I remember." "And now," he smiled faintly, "now, I think falling apart was the only way I could finally learn how to love." The words hung there tender, unguarded, real. Grace took a slow breath, her heart both steady and trembling. "You always did love in silence." "Ethan?" "Maybe that's why I never heard it." "Then let me say it now," he said quietly. Not as a confession, not as an apology, just as a truth. She looked at him, her eyes glistening in the lamplight. "Truth," she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the word. He stepped closer, leaving a respectful space between them. "Truth," he said again, "that I'll always care for you, that you taught me more about strength than any empire ever could, and that walking beside you, even if it's only as a friend, would be enough." Grace didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted past him, toward the open courtyard where laughter had faded into memory. She thought of the years between them, the pain, the distance, the healing that had taken root where heartbreak once lived. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "You're right. I don't need rescuing anymore." Ethan's breath caught slightly. He waited not for permission, but for truth. Then she added, "But no one said I had to walk alone." And with that, she reached out hesitant at first, then placed her hand gently in his. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't the spark of old romance or the rush of reclaimed love. It was something deeper, simpler. It was choice. They stood like that for a long while, their hands entwined, saying nothing. The night carried on around them the soft trill of crickets, the faint music drifting from a nearby street, the slow rhythm of the ocean's breath. When Grace finally spoke, her words came with the softness of truth. Maybe this isn't a beginning or an ending. Maybe it's just the right moment. Ethan nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything we've been, Grace, I'll take this moment. Every second of it." The lantern light flickered across their faces, catching in their eyes. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The space between them was already full of forgiveness, of respect, of something far quieter and far stronger than the love they once knew. As they began to walk together toward the garden's archway, their footsteps fell in rhythm, slow, steady, unhurried, and in the soft Carolina night, redemption didn't roar. It whispered, in the end. Ethan and Grace's story reminds us that success without compassion is just another kind of emptiness. We spend so much of our lives chasing control over our work, our image, even our hearts, only to discover that what truly defines us is how we treat the people who walk beside us. Grace teaches us that dignity isn't loud. It's quiet, steady, and born from endurance. And Ethan's journey shows that redemption doesn't come from grand apologies, but from the courage to change, to soften where life once made us hard. No matter our age or past mistakes, it's never too late to begin again, to listen more deeply, to love more gently, to lead not with power, but with kindness. Because in the soft moments, the ones the world rarely applauds, we find the truth that matters most, that love, forgiveness, and humility are the real measures of a life well lived. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love and redemption can bloom at any age, please give it a like. Share it with someone who might need a little light today. And subscribe to our channel for more soulful stories that speak to the heart. Your support helps us keep telling tales of courage, grace, and second chances. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep shining.